Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Matthew Chambers from the University of Reading, and I'll be speaking to you today about the afterlives of bookshops. In the early 20th century, there was an abundance of examples of shops publishing now canonical modernist literature, like Shakespeare and Company's Ulysses. In turn, they built coteries associated with their bookshops and gave shape to the cultural memory of literary modernism as a charged public exchange, a moment of social networking, as much as one of literary output. Of course, the same is said about numerous modernist institutions, periodicals, publishing houses, libraries, cafes, societies, clubs, and associations, not to mention institutions of higher education. And yet, out of all these examples, there's only one which stands out as a literary center and social space above all others, and that is Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company. In this paper, I'll review the persistence of Shakespeare and Company in the cultural memory of modernism, and I will also contrast Beach's shop with another business which has had a very different legacy, C.K. Ogden's Cambridge Magazine bookshop. In contrasting the well-remembered and the now forgotten, I'm not reclaiming one or critiquing the other, but rather I will illustrate the cultural and institutional conditions which produce these two results, and in turn, how that impacts dominant perceptions of the modernist book trade. Beach was hardly alone, and certainly wasn't the first person to run a bookshop in the manner she did, attempting to carve out a unique position in the trade. For example, Harold Monroe desired to centralize the poetry publishing market when he opened a poetry bookshop in London in 1913. And the hundreds of publications, books, magazines, pamphlets, anthologies, Christmas cards that he published attested to his desire to exert powerful shape over that market. Madge Jennison and Mary Mowbray Clark in New York City in 1916 opened a bookshop they named The Sunwise Tern, an old reference to making good fortune. They signaled their attraction to spirituality, mythology, and literature. Later in 1932, David Archer opened a bookshop in London in support of the Promethean Society, a group which supported new literary directions, education reform, greater awareness around sex and sexuality, and a broadly minded progressive attitude toward politics. Examples abound. There was Stanley Rose in Los Angeles, the Argus Bookshop in Chicago and New York, Der Sturm in Berlin, several more in London like Bermondsey Books, Progressive Books, Swemmers, and Colette's. In an edited collection called The Rise of the Modernist Bookshop, first published in 2014, Hugh Osborne has called these businesses modernist bookshops, and I followed suit in my last book. I've come to view the phrase with some skepticism. Authors, movements, and publications we would identify as modernist held strong connections with many of these bookshops, and the periodizing emphasis of the label modernist bookshop generates a certain simplicity of concept. On the other hand, it brackets off the literariness of the shops with the commerciality of the book trade in which these shops were situated, and thus obscures the full complexity of these businesses. With the two case studies I will review with you today, Shakespeare and Company and the Cambridge Magazine bookshop, I will discuss how our view or non-view of these shops has been conditioned by too strong an emphasis on the modernist, the acquisitional and archival consequences of this emphasis, and ultimately a bit about how I've been able to navigate the consequences. When I say Shakespeare and Company, you would likely understand me to mean the bookshop currently open in Paris, or you understand there was another earlier Shakespeare and Company open in interwar Paris. The link between the two entities illustrates the idea of afterlife more than it explains any business connection. For the link is both straightforward and in its resonances quite complicated. First, some background. Beach opened Shakespeare and Company in 1919, and it quickly became a burgeoning center of Anglophonic literary activity in interwar Paris. Beach's most recognized achievement was publishing James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922, and the notoriety which followed the author and his novel cemented the bookshop as a modernist literary center, drawing customers from all over the world. By 1941, following the Nazi occupation of Paris, Beach shuttered Shakespeare and Company for good. This potted history hardly does justice to the full range of Shakespeare and Company's activities, nor does it explain its real impact effectively. What it does show, however, is that between its famous clientele and its firm interwar dates of operation, 1919 to 1941. The story of the bookshop is a straightforward one to tell, a time capsule of an expatriate Paris we can easily visualize and digest. It's bounded with a clear beginning, an exciting middle, and a definitive end. Its abrupt closure produced something else. With the emergency storage of all the bookshop's stock and records, and that stock's survival through the war, it resulted in a coherent archive of business records maintained by a woman with her own story to tell. Melanie Messier has recently argued in the Passion Project's Modernist Women, Intimate Archives, Unfinished Lives, that Beach's form of self-presentation, especially when it came to her late life archival curation and memoir writing, served as a deliberate type of memorialization. Quote, "These intimate biographical practices, which document the trace of desire between women with very different relations to avowal and orientation, feminism and lesbianism, and the work of partnership in private and professional life, are driven by an implicitly pedagogical, future-oriented impulse." Indeed, following her partner Adrienne Monier's death in 1955, Beach was even more acutely aware of the pressure to leave behind an archive to represent their stories. Messier points to an unpublished page from the manuscript of Beach's memoir, The Bookshop, where Beach wonders at her purpose after Monier's death. "Sometimes you wish you had left with her," as she suggested. "She knew what living without her was going to be like. She knew everything, Adrienne. But leaving my jobs unfinished, I seemed to feel it important to tidy up before going. Why were years not enough to clear away rubbish? Why and how and when and where did it accumulate? Been playing around all my life." Even after her Shakespeare and Company had long closed, Beach was intent on presenting the memory of the shop within terms she designed. Messier has argued that Beach's last years were preoccupied with the cultivation and demonstration of an archival consciousness. She continues, "Beach's official period, she was writing a memoir, cataloging her massive archive of literary material, and curating a major cultural exhibit filled with artifacts from her personal collection. I suggest that we must understand these activities as interrelated modes of turning years of personal witness into public testimony and commentary. This is the act of collection, of curation, rather than creation and innovation as modernist artistic work." Where it may differ from Messier a bit is in terms of the time frame. Beach was always cultivating an idea of what Shakespeare and Company was right from the outset. The official period was simply an extension and rolling up of that exercise. If Shakespeare and Company was an experiential space, then archiving the memory of the bookshop was more than turning years of personal witness into public testimony and commentary. It was a final form of public outreach and networking, drawing us, the future participants in the memory of Shakespeare and Company, and into an idea of the bookshop as a communal space. Beach's self-archivization and self-narrative processes resulted in a detailed and clear version of Shakespeare and Company's history. The placing of most of her papers at Princeton has more recently netted another result, the Shakespeare and Company Project, a database which details the borrowing and purchasing histories of Shakespeare and Company members. Through the impressive amount of data available, modernist consumption and reading habits can be unpicked. The project adds granularity to the smooth story of Shakespeare and Company as the modernist bookshop par excellence, and Beach is the so-called midwife of modernism, not my phrase. With the forthcoming scholarly apparatus to be published by Modernism and Modernity in the Journal of Cultural Analytics, the endeavor spotlights what's possible when a large cache of data archived under a singular entity is available. And yet, it is arguable whether such a project would derive much interest were it not for the extra archival legacy in which Shakespeare and Company is memorialized and commodified. George Whitman, pictured here, an American who came to Paris in the late 1940s to study, met Sylvia Beach in 1950, and opened his Mistral bookshop in 1951. Whitman never hid his admiration for Beach. Mistral, in many respects, modeled itself after Beach's Shakespeare and Company. It hosted a lending library, was a favorite locale for Parisian literary figures, and Whitman was generous with his patrons as well, even offering beds for those passing through in exchange for help around the shop. He never partnered with Beach, and she never formally endorsed the idea of reopening Shakespeare and Company. But when Mistral closed for renovations in 1964, it reopened as Shakespeare and Company. Beach had died in 1962. Whitman reported to the New York Times that, quote, Sylvia Beach often told me that mine was the kind of bookstore she liked. She gave me the impression that she thought of it as the spiritual successor to Shakespeare and Company. The skeptic would argue that Whitman waited for after Beach's death, and with no immediate family to object, to change the name and capitalize on the associative power of it. His claim to an effective link between the two bookshops obscures the commercial benefits of the association while playing up the literariness of the link. And Whitman definitely lent into the association. He established a Sylvia Beach Memorial Library in the shop and named his daughter Sylvia, who currently manages the shop. Now, under Sylvia Whitman's management, the bookshop published a history of Shakespeare and Company, which contains a chapter on Sylvia Beach's shop, folding it into the Whitman's own story. There are, in fact, two links constructed here. The original signaling of literariness Beach attempted with the naming the shop Shakespeare and Company, in which Whitman continued, and the link to the specific literariness of interwar Paris. That there were no practical, substantive business connections between Beach and Whitman hardly matters. As spiritual successor, Whitman's Shakespeare and Company has packaged and sold a cultural and historical depth to the literariness of his bookshop. In other words, where it mattered for Beach that her customers knew Ernest Hemingway shopped at Shakespeare and Company, for Whitman's Shakespeare and Company, it only matters that you can imagine he did. It is a form of selling that appears to be especially suitable for books and the associative power of the written word. As Jessica Pressman reminds us in Bookishness, quote, books have always served a memorial function. Their codexical structure is a storage medium for text as well as other objects, flowers, letters, fabric swaths, etc. The book has also been imagined as a prosthetic device that extends human memory, an archive of human expression and history, end quote. The power of association used by Beach and Whitman extends past the physical space of the bookshop. Children's books, novels, and even films have blurred whose Shakespeare and Company it is anyway, capitalizing on an embalmed concept of modernist Paris, portable and consumable today. Whose Shakespeare and Company is it anyway fades from view as the answer is the shop you walk in now and all its earlier iterations, addresses, and memories it invokes. In referring to itself as the rag and bone shop of the heart, deliberately leading off the modifier, that foul, it is selling the idea of a return to artistic and spiritual enrichment through the everyday essential materials of the bookshop, a shop which blurs and spans literary time. I had earlier mentioned a contrast I'd offer, C.K. Ogden's Cambridge Magazine bookshop. It is correct if you have not heard of it. Opened in 1917 in Cambridge, after several years of Ogden editing the Cambridge Magazine, and more on that in a moment, the bookshop shared many of the same attributes and functions as Shakespeare and Company. It was associated with the notorious publication, it was run by a charismatic owner with extensive connections to literary figures and intellectuals, and a shop life which ran for approximately the same amount of time, 1917 to about 1939. The Cambridge Magazine publication itself, founded in 1911, was originally a kind of student paper, rounding up town and gown news and concerns, and was heavily subsidized by local advertising. As the First World War churned on, Ogden began running a segment gathering and republishing international news coverage of the war, including from the German press. The contents of the magazine are difficult to summarize. It ran weekly for near a decade. It often reflected Ogden's diverse interests from women's suffrage to education reform, and featured contributions from Siegfried Sassoon, Harold Monroe, Bertrand Russell, Jane Harrison, Gilbert Murray, and Arthur Quiller Couch, as well as Ogden writing as a woman named Adeline Moore. It was not an overtly literary magazine, but its London distribution was handled by Henderson's, which published the poetry magazine Coterie, which had published T.S. Eliot and Amy Lowell and Aldous Huxley and others. And it was known to stock radical literature as well, Henderson's was. And Ogden even struck an agreement with Harold Monroe of the Poetry Bookshop, where they would stock each other's publications, as well as promote and distribute them. Ogden opened the first Cambridge Magazine bookshop in 1917, and soon ran several branches across Cambridge. I'll return to the question of what it stocked in a moment, But it should first be noted that perhaps the shop is most famous for being vandalized after Armistice Day by drunken revelers targeting what it took to be Ogden's pacifist views. The incident was observed by I.A. Richards, who recounts it as an early, if not first, conversation with Ogden. The shops all survived this moment, and even as the magazine morphed into Psyche, a journal of general and linguistic psychology, reflecting Ogden's new collaborations with Richards around basic English, collaborations for which Ogden is best remembered, Cambridge Magazine bookshops continued until around 1939, albeit without the charged association with the journal, which was its cause and founding. Now, unlike the comprehensive records which survive for Beach's business, including detailed records of stock orders and sales, we have less in the way of documentation for the Cambridge Magazine bookshops, primarily held at McMaster University in Toronto. We have some sense of his core stock from listings in later issues of Cambridge Magazine, but it is partial, and we are left with not knowing much about where it all ended up. It is not beyond reason that Ogden absorbed the stock into his private library. By the end of his life, he had amassed around 80,000 volumes. University College London purchased 20,000 volumes to, quote, encourage research in the fields of communications. And the remainder of his library is purchased by the University of California Libraries after his death in 1957. That collection was promptly divided between various University of California locations. Their lead librarian at the time recounts how, for example, they placed a second folio of Shakespeare. As it was not needed at Berkeley and Los Angeles, it could go to Davis, Riverside, or Santa Barbara. Not wishing to decide the placing of the volume by such a bourgeois action as the flipping of a coin, it was decided to base the placement on the outcome of the World Series. Davis was fortunate in drawing the New York Yankees, who knocked in the winning run in the 1958 baseball series, which also meant the second folio was pitched out to the Davis campus. There are other stories about how casually this collection was treated, and indeed its acquisition was not fully recorded, so there's no way of knowing its full contents. But the cumulative result between what is available at McMaster and what was split across California, most of which was not processed from his library, even though University of California Davis still makes reference to the, quote, C.K. Ogden collection on the website. My concern today is not the apparition of that dispersed library, however much it might upset me. My concern is the opportunity that libraries may represent a better understanding what kind of bookshops the Cambridge Magazine was. Bookshop labels or pricing in Ogden's handwriting, anything to note that a title in his private collection is unsold store stock. Was the store just a means to hoard paper to pulp for future Cambridge Magazine issues, as one advertisement announced? Did Ogden find a better way to network and distribute by operating multiple shop fronts? Can any legacy of the shop be traced? Would we have as clear a historical memory of literary Cambridge from this period as we do literary Paris? I'd like to wrap up with a comment on modernist archives, acquisitional and archival logics, especially in the mid-20th century, and how to navigate them today if one wants to research bookselling from the period. As Melanie Messier's book underscores, the archival consciousness of queer women and the archival projects they produced resulted in varied methods of record keeping. And as her book gestures, the acquisitional and archival logics of institutional archives has not been historically diverse. Jean-Christophe Cloutier in Shadow Archives, Life Cycles of African American Literature, and Amy Hildreth Chen in Placing Papers, The American Literary Archives Market, have both recently discussed how, in an American context, mid to late 20th century acquisitional emphases focus on white male authors with rare exception. For example, Chen, using the Norton Anthology of American Literature as a boundary marker, or an easily, quote, an easily perceived status marker that becomes a shortcut to verifying quality. She has broken down author acquisitions into white men, white women, minority men, and minority women, and plotted the numbers from the anthology who had their papers collected between the 1950s and the 2010s. The papers of minority authors were not collected until the 1980s, and as of her reckoning at the time of publication in 2020, out of 78 authors, 22 were minority individuals, and 25 were women of any racial identity. The archival gaps, again historically, have not always been identity-based. In terms of literature, archives have long emphasized author papers. And that focus has broadened to cover the marketplace in which those authors were published and disseminated. With the emphasis on the author, the organizing logic has long been to link whatever institutional acquisitions to the author. So publisher archives, editor and agent papers, and even literary society and association papers all earn relevance because of the study of authors. Sylvia Beach, a near exception which proves the rule, held an attractive archive for Buffalo and Princeton because of the immense mid-century interest in James Joyce. The Cambridge Magazine papers, such as they are, exist as part of C.K. Ogden's personal papers and were thus acquired as author papers. The same holds true for the Psychic Bookshop records as part of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle papers at the Harry Ransom Center. Indeed, the Harry Ransom Center, which holds so much, has several bookshop papers in their holdings, but they more often than not appear to be stronger with author correspondence and printing concerns than retail. Or there are the papers of the Argus Bookshop in Chicago and New York City at Yale University, which is just author correspondence after the owner permitted their sale, but instructed his daughter to destroy the business records. In short, the archival consciousness around bookselling needs improving. There is some light, however. The Gotham Bookmart holdings at the Harry Ransom Center include business records, although admittedly mostly post-Second World War, and thus give a more fleshed out picture of the life of that bookshop. There is also more recently a discovered cache of Sunwise Turn records at Ohio State University, where the Harry Ransom Center records for Sunwise Turn again mostly contain materials related to publishing and author correspondence. An intrepid researcher trekked into the woods of upstate New York and retrieved boxes of business records left to rot in an abandoned house. And hopefully there's more to come. Thanks for listening.